Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with 10 recordings featuring the best percussion playing ever. Well, some of the best percussion playing ever. There's a lot of them. This is 10 personal favorites, and I have to say, talking about percussion is really, really tricky because we have to really define our parameters. The percussion instruments only came into their own as a sort of virtuoso orchestral section of the 20th century, and specifically in the latter half of the 20th century, for the most part. But those are not the works that I'm usually talking about because they all kind of sound the same. Nowadays, you expect modern works to make virtuoso use of percussion sections, and the percussion players to be marvelous, and they are. But the problem with percussion instruments, other than timpani, is that they don't have very much character. Even timpani don't have very much character, but at least you can differentiate them. I mean, there is no way in hell that you're going to be able to tell one virtuoso xylophonist from another virtuoso xylophonist. They are not expressive instruments. Let's not kid ourselves, right? None of them are. They just make noise. They make noise and color. And so what are they best used for? Percussion instruments are best used, and great percussion playing is when they are used as an adjunct to whatever else is going on in the orchestra. That is, to mark rhythm in dance-type music or march-type music, obviously, and to color the melodic and accompanying instrumental lines, which are also usually being played by other instruments. Sometimes there are solo licks for just percussion. Yes, you may hear a tuned percussion solo, a glockenspiel solo, a xylophone solo, some bells, something. Possible. It's possible. But the way that percussion is best played, in my view, and where I can point out particularly distinctive examples of it, is when percussion instruments are used in their traditional role, when they're not gigantic solo agglomerations within the rest of the orchestra. And that's especially true of mallet parts, of mallet instruments, because that's where a lot of the advance in percussion technique has come, because you have to play notes and you can stick, mallets between your fingers and hit 56 mallet things at once. I mean, you can do all kinds of cool stuff with mallets. Are they musically necessary? Yeah. Are they musically interesting? Yeah. I mean, in my view, mallet instruments, idiophones, which is what these things are technically called, I think, are best heard and enjoyed in their original context, which is within a Balinese gamelan, which is like incredible. I love Balinese gamelan because all of the instruments are of the same kind. And so they go well together naturally. But to have this sort of gamelan-like thing sitting within a regular orchestra where it doesn't really blend in with what everyone else is doing. Yes, you could write pieces like Taboo Taboo Hand by Colin McPhee, where you have a gamelan type ensemble, but that's an orchestra imitating a gamelan. That's a little different. To have just a normal piece of music and then all of a sudden you've got all this other stuff happening with percussion. I have questions about it. I have questions about it aesthetically. I think that today, because we have these fantastic percussion sections in major orchestras, that modern composers feel a necessity to write for them, to give them things to do. And in giving them things to do, they are often, I think, detracting from other more important things like the musical argument and clarity of orchestration. And, that's me. I may be a little bit old-fashioned and regressive when it comes to that because I am full of admiration for the virtuosity of today's percussionists. I really am. I am just less impressed with the ability of today's composers to write for them meaningfully within the context of their other pieces. And so, here are 10 recordings using a traditional percussion section played amazingly well. I mean, that brings out parts of a score that you just don't normally hear. And that really irritates me because I'm into clarity. I do look at scores. I'm into clarity. I see what composers wrote and I see what the players do. And as often as not, you're not hearing what the composers wrote, particularly when it comes to percussion. Because not only is percussion best heard in its absence. I mean, it's, in other words, conductors don't care if you hear it or not. They also tinker with it relentlessly. People very seldom play what composers actually wrote. So that's a whole nother issue that we could talk about at some point. So let's start at the beginning with Ravel. Of course, you have to do Ravel. The great orchestrators wrote the best percussion parts, right? I mean, that goes without saying. Ravel's Mother Goose Ballet with the Boston Symphony Orchestra and Seiji Ozawa. Wow, what gorgeous percussion playing. Gorgeous, atmospheric. It creates the magic that is so much a part of this score and does so with absolute perfect sensitivity and elegance and grace and clarity. I mean, it's just glorious, absolutely glorious. And I'm going to say straight out, the best percussion sections are to be found in American orchestras and British orchestras from the post-war period. European orchestras, generally speaking, took a bit of time to catch up, and that's because of the repertoire that they played. It's really that simple. The British musical renaissance took place in the 20th century. American orchestral music is a 20th century phenomenon. It uses a lot of intricately rhythmic stuff, and it uses percussion to emphasize both the color of the orchestra and that rhythmic stuff. And so the American and British orchestras tended to have modern percussion sections with good instruments, at least after the 1950s, when you could actually hear things like tam-tams that didn't sound like you're hitting a pot with a wooden spoon, and tambourines that have some glitter, and triangles that don't sound like dinner bells. And the quality of instruments was critical. And European orchestras, even the big major ones like the Berlin Philharmonic, they didn't have very good percussion instruments, or you didn't hear them if they had them. They really didn't. And the radio orchestras and all that stuff, it took them time, a lot of time to catch up. And then once they did, they were fine. They've caught up. I mean, they have. But up to that point, nah. So anyway, Ravel, Mother Goose, yeah, it's fabulous with Ozawa. Next, Richard Strauss, Macbeth. Now, Macbeth has a climax. I mean, it's a horrifying climax with screamy, scary climax with a tam-tam marked fortissimo, which you never hear, except in Nimi Järvi's recording with the Scottish National Orchestra, where they all just go completely crazy and blast and smash the thing like, sometimes that's what great playing is. It's not all sensitivity. There's also violence and part of the clarity of hearing parts in loud sections where they should cut. I mean, a tam-tam should be the loudest thing in the orchestra at any volume. It should be able to drown out everybody else except for a full organ or something, or a brass section, And you've got to hear it at that climax. And it's amazing to me how people, and conductors particularly, don't care about the art of playing loud. I did a whole video about this topic, by the way. Why are orchestras afraid to play loud? Well, they're not afraid to play loud here. You actually hear that fabulous crashing tam-tam part with the bass drum thudding and all this stuff. It's great. And if it drowns out a little bit of the extra parts, well, that's okay. That's okay, because that's what Strauss wanted. He wanted a horrifying din, and that's what we get. It's an absolute magnificent performance. Fantastic. And the Scottish National Orchestra is one of those orchestras which has come into its own since the 60s and 70s, and plays splendidly now, and has that wonderful modern balance of sound where you hear the percussion section well, and and the brass is also extremely fine. And not everything is based on string tone, as it is with the traditional German and Central European orchestras. So yeah, Strauss's Macbeth, wow, hot stuff. Next, Mahler. Well, we've got to do a couple Mahlers because Mahler is the ultimate symphonic orchestrator. He really is. Let's not kid ourselves. And his percussion writing is not only brilliant and necessary, but it's musical. That is, the parts, they contribute something to what's going on in the orchestra. Sometimes it's melodic, sometimes it's purely rhythmic or timbral. But Mahler understood, like few other composers, the possibilities of musically used percussion in a traditional symphonic context. So we begin with the Second Symphony, and this recording is the Concertgebouw Orchestra, the Royal. Now, Royal, I leave off the Royals because the Concertgebouw Orchestra under Bernard Haitink, who, believe it or not, is going to show up more than once here. Yeah, along with his orchestra. And the Resurrection, this was Haitink's first recording of it. It's an earlier recording. It is not sonically perfect because Phillips hadn't figured out how to put bass into their recordings yet, at least in the Concertgebouw. But wow, can you hear everything down through the texture? And the Concertgebouw at this period, like most European orchestras, had some very idiosyncratic instruments. They had a low tam-tam that was marvelous at subdued dynamic levels. You actually heard it perfectly in pianissimo. Remarkable. I mean, it's very, very seldom. There's a huge part for quiet tam-tam in Mahler's Second Symphony. The first time I heard the part was in this performance, in the first movement particularly, during the march. Dum, 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 da, 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 like that. Just unbelievably beautiful. They had very high, very bright sounding cymbals, brittle almost, glassy in quality. I mean, they just had a really typical sound. The timpani were large and boomy. They weren't hard drums. They were soft drums and very, very musical, wonderfully tuned with the rest of the orchestra. That quality is gone from the Concertgebouw. They don't use those instruments anymore. And so you don't get to hear, especially in Mahler too, where you have a high tam-tam and a low tam-tam. And they sound so distinctive. The cymbals, everything about this orchestra sounded distinctive in those days. They really did. And as time went on, they modernized and they bought new instruments, and those instruments were better in some respects. I mean, they were more audible and more typical of what I think some of the composers were looking for, but I miss that traditional sound. I miss a traditional sound which was a good sound, which allowed you to hear things. It allowed you to color the sound of the whole orchestra in ways that nobody else could, just because of the quality of the instruments. I was told that those old tam-tams that the Concertgebouw had were UFIPs. That's from Italy. They were not the usual Paistas or Wuhans. Wuhans were kind of rare in those days. And Paistas were available because that was a European company. And UFIP is Union Fabbricazione Strumenti Piatti Tam-Tams. And they're in, I think, Pistoia, Italy. I have some UFIP tam-tams, by the way, which I've shown at various times. They're a wonderful company, and they make very distinctive sounding instruments. And I think that's what the Concertgebouw was using. At least someone told me that's what they were using. So in that Mahler too, maybe that's what we're hearing. They also used bell plates instead of chimes, big metal squares that you whack with mallets. Sometimes they worked, and sometimes they really didn't. For the deep bells, because most of the time you couldn't hear them at all. But it was a distinctive sound. Next, Mussorgsky, Ravel, Pictures in an Exhibition, Ormandy and Philly, because it has the best Great Gate of Kiev ever. It's that simple. I mean, nobody did the Great Gate of Kiev as well as Ormandy did. And he didn't do it as well on his second recording of the work either. This one on Sony, somehow everything just went well. Not only is the playing incredible throughout this Pictures in an Exhibition, but it is a clinic in sensitive musical use of percussion instruments to color the overall sound. Now, Ormandy was a meddler. He would take out tons of percussion parts and readjust and do all kinds of things. But here, he basically does what Ravel wrote, and the end of the Great Gate of Kiev. Wow, where you hear the bell and the tam-tam and the bass drum and everything going with the brass playing. Whew, there's nothing like it. It's just one of those unbelievably fabulous moments where everything went well. And now we go to the UK, the good old UK, to the London Symphony, which has always had a splendid percussion section, at least after the 60s and 70s, when they really came into their own. And they played all that wonderful music. I mean, the Vaughan Williams Symphonia Antarctica with Previn, the Tarangalela Symphony with Previn, and some other things. And then Abbado showed up, and he did Alexander Nevsky. And Alexander Nevsky is a percussion symposium. I mean, I've played it, I know, with glockenspiels and xylophones and tam-tams and maracas and all kinds of nifty stuff, tambourines. And this Alexander Nevsky is so well done. The battle on the ice is extraordinary. The Crusaders in Pskov, where you've got those huge swats on the tam-tam and thuds on the bass drum, and then all the mallet playing in the last movement. It's an extraordinary, extraordinary performance with those percussion parts perfectly delineated and balanced and contributing to the overall color of the work. And it's wonderfully recorded, too. It just sounds great. It blew me away when I first heard it, and it still does. Now, back to Mahler. Symphony number 7, a piece that's full of exotic and interesting percussive sounds, which so seldom come off well in recordings. And the one that did it best was one of the first, Bernstein. Again with the New York Phil this time. Oh, I said it's the first time I've used the New York Phil. Yes, there are other recordings with New York Phil I was thinking about, like the Boulez Bartok Miraculous Mandarin, which is also great. But Bernstein Mahler 7, you hear the cowbells, you hear the chimes, you hear the soft tam-tam, you hear the suspended cymbals, you hear everything that Mahler wrote in that piece. The weird tambourine jingles, the snare drum going up and up and up at the end of the first movement. I mean, there's so many moments, wonderful, wonderful moments where you should really hear something happening, something to color the sound. It's one of Mahler's, well, not Mahler's most amazing, but certainly one of his most amazing orchestrations. And there's so many other recordings that I've heard where, if you imprint on that Bernstein recording, then everyone else is going to sound somehow a little bit colorless. The only one that doesn't is Haitink and the Concertgebouw, his first one, because that too has all of those wonderful special sounds that the Concertgebouw could make. And the New York Philharmonic, whatever you say about them, and they could sound like pigs. I mean, they weren't in the mood. They were kind of like the Paris Conservatory Orchestra. When they were on, they were unbelievable, and their percussion section was almost always fabulous. It really was. It was a true American percussion section. That is, they had rhythm, they had color, they had crispness and clarity, and it's absolutely splendid. That Mahler 7th is special and a wonderful, wonderful example of what percussion adds to the traditional orchestration, the symphonic orchestration that we're used to when it's done correctly and sensitively and with the right feeling for atmosphere and color and all that stuff. So Mahler 7, Bernstein, New York Phil, for sure. Next, Stravinsky, we got to do a Rite of Spring, right? Because it's a percussion fest, particularly for the heavy-duty percussion, the tam-tam, the bass drum, all of that stuff. But also there's a guiro. There's a guiro, the Rite of Spring. It's in the procession of the sage, when everything's going, the first movement. First part, pardon me. The guiro is going, guiro is just a gourd that you scrape. And, Stravinsky does a bunch of other things, too. There are antique cymbals in triangle, doubling each other. Da, 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 ting, 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 like that. So there's all kinds of little touches, but really what you listen to the Rite of Spring for is for when they really let it rip. And no one lets it rip like Chailly and the Cleveland Orchestra. The Cleveland Orchestra, of course, is known for its rhythm and power and sensitivity and amazing ability to create a coherent ensemble sound, including percussion instruments. The only other pick I had using Cleveland, there was another one that I could have used. Well, there's several others I could have used. But the other one that really stands to mind is their Debussy Image with Boulez, especially Iberia, which is just unbelievable in its crispness and point. But I've talked about that recording elsewhere too. So let's do a Rite of Spring then with Chailly and Cleveland. Wow. You will never hear a percussion section play the music with that kind of power and crispness. And Boulez got the same thing, too, when he recorded the Rite of Spring in Cleveland. He did it twice, but his first one for Sony is better recorded and has better balances. So, there's that one, too. But I like Chailly. I really do. That one just shocked me when I first heard it. It was amazing because the sonics were so powerful. Sonics matter with percussion because percussion is noise. And you have to have great recorded sound. If you don't, then... if you can't hear the bass drum, then you can't say the percussion playing is wonderful, can you? So it's a real problem. Next we are dealing with only one percussion instrument, timpani. Now there are many, many recordings with great timpani players because timpani was the single percussion instrument that historically was cultivated. Because, of course, the entire basic repertoire at least requires timpani, if it requires percussion at all. So there were great timpanists. There was Werner Therichen in Berlin and lots of other people. But the timpanist The timpanist to end all timpanists was Vic Firth, who played in Boston for like 60 years or 50 years or some unbelievable quantity of time, founded his own percussion, mallet, and other instrument company. I mean, he was a legend in the percussion universe, and one performance where you can really hear his mastery, and it is absolute, over his instrument is his Sibelius Fifth Symphony. And you want to hear a piece that requires really musical timpani playing, especially in quiet levels, quiet dynamics. And Sibelius is one of those guys because he uses timpani almost like a continuo. They follow the melody line of the orchestra so frequently, and you get to hear them do all kinds of marvelous things in his Fifth Symphony. At the very end, da, 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 boom, boom, da, the timpani. And at the end of the first movement, that's where fascinating things happen, because it's a part which is almost impossible to play clearly, and Firth does it. Especially at the end, it's da 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 ba da 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 bum bum right at the end, and then da 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 bum ba dum ba da 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 da, and the timpanist goes like this. He's following the violins, which are going da 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 da, and then he's got chords and double note tremolos, which is like, it's, two drums, and try and make that sound clearly. In most orchestral performances, you don't even know what they're doing. You just hear this sort of incoherent roaring on the bottom of the orchestra. Not with Vic Firth and Colin Davis in the Boston Symphony. End of the first movement of Sibelius Fifth. Go listen to it. It's amazing what you're going to hear. That opens up a whole new world of Sibelian timbral magic to be able to hear that done properly. But the entire performance is just amazing. The timpani part there is played with just incredible finesse and virtuosity and musicality. And so that's just a record you've got to hear. I remember when I first played that, I remember I was in France. I first played it for my friend Christophe Huss, the music critic at Le Devoir in Montreal. He was living in France then and working for Repertoire magazine. And we were talking about Sibelius Fifth. It came up, and he had a record collection like this, only like I did. And we both had like studio apartments, and they were floor-to-ceiling CDs. And he had that recording. And I said to him, you got to listen. Focus on the ending of the first movement of Sibelius Fifth in that recording. You will hear things you hear nowhere else. And he listened to it. And he went, ooh, yeah. It's really something to listen for. Now, if people don't get it right, and every other performance ever made doesn't really, you don't hear it with the same kind of clarity, it doesn't mean there's something wrong with the performance or that it's bad. You might even say it's not the most felicitous writing on Sibelius's part to do something like that, knowing that you probably were never going to hear it clearly or plainly. But when you do, when they take the time and effort, it's magical. So after Sibelius, Shostakovich, back to the Concertgebouw, astonishing with their new percussion section, or newer percussion section, different tam-tams, different a lot of things. And it's Babi with Haitink. A piece that requires an enormous amount of percussive playing. In the first couple of movements, it's mostly loud, huge climaxes with the bell going bong, the tam-tam crash, and the climaxes of the first movement, and then in humor, all of that witticism, musical witticism, urged on by like the slapstick, the whip and tambourine and other instruments. But then in the second part, it's mostly very spooky and quiet. Bass drum rolls, soft tam-tam crashes, maybe a little glockenspiel and fears. And then in the finale, where you have the celesta and just the bell, and really it requires a very, very wide range of percussive timbres. And as so often happened with Haitink in the Concertgebouw, with Haitink as a conductor, he rose to the occasion in pieces that needed it. And this Babi is amazing. It's a reference recording for the work, for sure. And the orchestra plays so powerfully and so beautifully, and it's all just gorgeously projected along with the chorus. You hear the power, you hear the volume, you have the dynamics, but it's never crude. It's never ridiculously overbearing, as it was, for example, in that Järvi Strauss recording, where it's supposed to be ridiculously overbearing. Don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong there, but here it's a different kind of playing, and it's just incredibly memorable, and it's indelibly etched into my memory. However, we have to wrap it up here with number 10, and number 10 is a classic, iconic recording that has never been equaled, and it's the Reiner Respighi Pines of Rome. Oh, it's an amazing performance. You know it's an amazing performance. That piece is a percussion fiesta, not least because the percussionists get to play the recording of the nightingale at the end of the, wherever the little birdie is tweeting in the pines there. But after that, you've got so much quiet stuff happening. Soft tam-tam strokes, tam-tam rolls, bass drum rolls, gentle sounds. That become, of course, huge sounds, cymbal crashes later, and all kinds of stuff going on. It's an unbelievably fantastic performance with absolute top-to-bottom transparency, and it has never been equaled. Never been equaled. Certainly not at the climax at the end, where you've got cymbals going chunt, tam, tam, crash, the bass drum going dong, 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 the timpani pounding underneath it, and wow. And at the very beginning, the glockenspiel, it's with harps doing the glissando thing. It's an extraordinary sonic job. The recording is amazing, absolutely amazing. But you hear that orchestra playing, that section playing with total fabulous transparency. And that tam-tam, I understand, was destroyed. I was told it was broken in a performance of La Mère. Unfortunately, at some point, I think it was under Reiner too. So that instrument is gone. That marvelous instrument they had for these pieces isn't used, and you don't hear it anymore. And you certainly don't hear it in Schulte's recording, because Schulte didn't really care for percussion. For all of his brutality and noise and whatnot, he did not achieve anything like the clarity and the timbral sensitivity that Reiner showed in his recordings. Not even close. So with that, my friends, there are 10 recordings where really show you the potential of great percussion playing in a standard symphonic context. After that, sky's the limit, right? So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.